Okay, so I don't think anyone came in since the last presentation. Lots of people leaving, sadly, but no one's come in. So I'll not introduce myself again. Talking about another case study for CUES. So CUES it stands for the Credit Union Executive Society. So they're a professional body, and they work with credit unions, particularly leadership within credit unions, so CEOs, directors, people with leadership potential. And so their members kind of pay a fee to be part of the organisation, and I'm sure they get lots of benefits. The benefits that we're interested in for this project is that they get access to a bunch of learning resources. These members also learn from places outside what CUES provided on the internet. They've got 13,000 member organisations across the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. So that's CUES. And so CUES had this project. They wanted to make data available for themselves, but also, and perhaps more importantly, they also wanted to make the data available for their member organisations. So the kind of questions that CUES themselves had are which learners, and more importantly, which credit unions are most active and engaged, because if they're not active and engaged, are they going to say, well, maybe why are we paying for this service? Which content and which content types are most useful, so that they can then produce more of that content and more of those content types, or maybe promote them more. And also, for both of those types of usage, how does that change over time? For the organisations themselves, they want to know how their employees are doing, both in terms of assessments, in terms of progress through, perhaps. They want to know if they're getting good value for money, if it's actually being used, they're paying for this service, is it getting used? And also they want to know, is the learning effective? People are doing it, spending time completing these learning materials, that's costly, people's time. Is it actually making them better at being credit union managers or whatever? And actually, there's some research done by Deloitte that says that only 14% of organisations actually track informal learning activities. And I'm not sure exactly how informal learning activities are categorised here. Lost a bit. But I suspect that this kind of learning on external websites, from the perspective of organisations, like CUES, like perhaps things like lynda.com, etc., that those, I assume, come under the category of informal activities. And perhaps the reason for that is it's often quite difficult for organisations to get data from those external sources, and often it doesn't happen. So perhaps a challenge for universities there is how easy is it for an employer or perhaps a future employer to get data about learners who either apply for jobs or come to their organisations. How easy is it for learners to take that data with them? And even if they can take the data with them, or employers can access the data, is it in a usable format? So that's just something to think about. We capture the data through Experience API, and it's really good, and there's lots of reasons why it's really good, as I said in the last presentation. So in terms of data sources, CUES had 3 different data sources. Firstly, they have their CUES portal, which you can think of a bit like a VLE, including magazines and things like that. And the data that they're getting from that is basically usage. Who's using it? When are they using it? How often are they using it? That sort of thing. They also use Storm Cloud. Has anyone heard of Storm Cloud? Not many. Okay, so Storm Cloud could be thought of as an incredibly lightweight VLE that just launches e-learning courses. And in fact, like Blackboard, for example, the SCORM player within Blackboard is something called SCORM Engine, which is essentially the same thing as SCORM Cloud, but it's embedded in Blackboard, right? So just think of SCORM Cloud as just being that SCORM player. And so SCORM Cloud, they use that for their e-learning courses, and they get much more data there about assessment scores and how people answer questions and those sorts of things. And then finally, they have this thing at the bottom here, this bookmarklet, and that's something that the learners themselves can add to their browser. And if they go on a site outside of CUES that they find interesting and that they learn from, they can click a button and record that they went to that particular site. I'll talk more about the bookmarklet. In fact, now I'll talk more about the bookmarklet. So I don't know if probably many of you submit papers to LAK, and one thing that's different from maybe a corporate conference is you get feedback, which is really helpful. And particularly the person that reviewed this paper not only kind of gave feedback, but they asked questions as well. So I'd encourage you, if any of you do review papers at LAK, ask questions, because I found that really helpful. One of the questions they asked was, how effective was using the bookmarklet? What are the pros and cons? Is it viable? So for CUES, did the bookmarklet work for CUES? Well, unfortunately, no, it didn't. So I'm obviously known for honest papers, so let's have some honesty here. Yeah, there were some issues in technical barriers in installation. There were some issues to do with knowing who the person using the bookmarklet was the same person who was on the LMS. And there are also some issues, with the second set of issues we didn't resolve, where some websites actually block bookmarklets, presumably for security reasons. So if you use a bookmarklet on facebook.com, for example, it won't work. Facebook will stop you from doing that. And there are other websites that do that. So there were some technical issues. Then it wasn't really heavily promoted by CUES. This wasn't something that they really pushed learners to do, and perhaps as a result of that, learners haven't really used it very much at all. And perhaps another reason for that is actually all the data that's relevant for CUES is coming from these other sources. And those other sources were really quite easy to set up, or certainly comparatively easy, and they get all the data to answer their questions from those data sources. So the bookmarklet data, which is probably a lot more spread out in terms of the sites people are visiting, even if they were using it, is less useful. That said, I think in other contexts, a bookmarklet could be useful. And actually, I think the bookmarklet needs to be incentivized, it needs to be promoted. And there are products that exist that have an xAPI bookmarklet where there is an incentive to use that bookmarklet. The one on the slide there is Teslo, and that's a social learning platform, and the idea is that you record your learning wherever you're doing it, and they've got a mobile app, they've got a bookmarklet, and you bring that all together, and then you share it with other people. And so the fact that you're then going to share it, that provides the incentive, and there are other incentives around why would you share it with other people. So there's a reason why learners bookmark. And actually, just as I was practicing these slides, I thought there's another product, I think, and Ben can correct me on this if I'm wrong, I believe Curator, which is another social learning platform, has a bookmarklet. But again, there's an incentive to use that bookmarklet. It's not just that we're getting the data, the students have a reason to use it. So moving on to the visualizations again, and again, if any of you want a fuller demo of Watershed, I'm very happy to do that. But on Watershed, we have something called a dashboard. The idea of the dashboard is to give you the information you need in your face as soon as you open it up. So it's a lot of different high-level statistics. In this case, we're getting an overview of what's going on in terms of popular content, and you can see the arrows there kind of up and down of what's increasing, what's decreasing. So CUES can very easily see what's going on, or their managers within the credit unions can see what's going on. And what I'll mention at this point as well is that all of the data is very restricted. So if I work for one credit union, I can't see what another credit union's data is, obviously. And also, even if I'm a manager within a credit union, I can only see the people that work for me. So that control of who sees what is very important. And then you can click on any of those cards and you can drill down into the detail and see what's going on. So you can see progress over time in that middle visualization there. And CUES would kind of hope that usage over time would be increasing, and actually they are seeing that in their real data. But they also might expect to see seasonal differences. Maybe there's a dip over Christmas, or maybe they have a promotional campaign for a particular area of content, and for that area of content, hopefully they see an increase after that promotional campaign. They can see how effective that was. Other cards look at different groups, how those groups are doing, scores on assessments, and even how people are answering assessments. So there's a whole wide range of visualizations to address their questions. So project challenges, the kind of brief for white papers for this asked to look at challenges. So we've got some challenges that we hit in implementing xAPI within CUES. So these aren't so much data challenges, but they're more challenges about just implementing xAPI in an organization. So the first challenge is scale. So a little story here is that not long before the launch of CUES, fortunately it was before the launch, but not long before the launch, we uploaded 10,000 learners and their groups to the CUES Watershed site. And we'd actually seen larger numbers of students before this, and certainly we've seen much larger numbers since, but something about the particular structure of groups, I never got a full explanation, but something about that structure of groups meant that it actually caused massive performance issues, a massive drain on the servers, and the site completely fell over. So don't worry, there's a happy ending. We got it back up and running in time for launch, but it was an issue, and there's definitely lessons to be learnt from that. So first one is test at scale prior to launch, which we did, but don't just test at scale. It's not just about numbers. Make sure that what you're testing with is realistic. Having a flexible infrastructure, like we use AWS, that's helpful, but obviously it's not the only factor. You can't just keep piling stuff on AWS. And the other thing is that performance and scale need to be an ongoing consideration. So for us, we're getting new clients all the time. Each client is creating more data all the time. More learners are coming in. And so we have this guy called Zach, who a good part of his job is on constantly improving performance and just pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And some of the things that he does, it's a simple change, and it leads to a very large improvement in performance. And a lot of those are code changes, but also he does stuff with the network infrastructure as well. So if you are going to be collecting large amounts of xAPI data from across a university, scale is something that you do need to think about, and performance is something you do need to think about. Another issue was uptake. So we submitted this paper back in October, and actually it wasn't that long after the launch of CUES. And at the time, they only had 80 members who had signed up for Watershed reporting. And this was lower than they wanted, so this was a concern for CUES. Now, again, good news. This has since increased to 400 since when we submitted the paper, so I'm glad that worked out. They've got over 40,000 learners now. So how did they achieve that increase? Well, ongoing promotion through press releases, emails, just telling people about this thing called Watershed, sharing stories, people who've done this before. And actually, again, this ties in with what the keynote was saying about iterations. The first time that they tried this with people, there was a lot of feedback. This is things that could be improved within Watershed. They shared that feedback with us. We helped them with some configuration things, but we also made changes to our product in response to that feedback. So that iteration was really important, and now the feedback that they're getting is really good. And we talked about iteration already. So another question from our friendly LAK paper reviewer is about outcomes. And I wasn't sure if this was a question about outcomes in terms of student outcomes or kind of outcomes in terms of the data. So I've kind of interpreted this question in both ways. In terms of outcomes about the data, I've not uploaded that slide, which I did this morning. That's a shame. Let me talk you through it anyway. So there was an extra slide about outcomes from the data, which basically I can't tell you exactly what the outcomes are, but I can talk about some general trends. So the first one is that in terms of usage and in terms of the content itself, there are clearly resources that get used a lot more than others. And in fact, the top rated resource was used 4 times as much as the next resource down. So there is something that they can see that. This is a really popular resource. We should perhaps promote this, and obviously they can see the resources that aren't being used. Again, in terms of content types, 2 of the content types had numbers of views in the thousands. All the other ones had numbers in the hundreds or even tens in some cases. So again, those are 2 content types that are clearly very significant, and ones either that they've just happened to have a lot of content on, so they'll need to compare that with other data, but maybe that's an area where people are using more content than other areas. In terms of the changes, the data was showing increases and decreases in terms of which learners were accessing stuff, and also for individual pieces of content, there were changes over time. No, sorry, that's not true. For content types, there were changes over time. But for individual pieces of content, it was fairly stable. So I'm not sure what the inference from that is, but I thought that might be an interesting thing for them to dig into. So but there are things in the data for them to look at. In terms of outcomes for the learners, well, CUES actually doesn't have access to data about learner performance. They go back to their credit unions, so they do their jobs, but that data is kind of private to the credit unions. They're probably not willing to share that data with CUES, which is perhaps a similar situation that universities are in. If you're looking at the impact of a degree on employment, are employers willing to give you that data? So that's a challenge. But I guess the good news there is that the individual member organizations can get the data. If they use xAPI, they could receive the data via xAPI. If not, they can download the aggregated data or even the statements as a CSV file and then combine it with their own data sets. So the individual organizations themselves could make those kinds of comparisons. And again, a challenge, how easy is it for learners and employers to get data out of your university, and could they use that data? So that's the end of that one. I don't know if anyone has any questions specific to that, or if you've thought of some more questions around xAPI since a few minutes ago.
Yeah, more things to come.
Andrew, you talked a little bit about scale and knocking the whole site over, but do you have an architecture in mind or in place for sort of retries or robustness in terms of making sure there's all the events get in?
Yeah, excellent question. So that's a question that comes down to the systems that are sending the data, and different systems do that better than others. So if you're talking about a JavaScript-based e-learning course, all the tracking code is actually happening on the learner's computer, which means if the learner's computer dies, you've lost the data. So there's a challenge there. And you want to also make sure you're not sending the data twice. So that there are complexities there. If it's really, really important that you get every single xAPI statement, it is something that you have to consider and think about, what are you going to do in this scenario, in that scenario. We always encourage people, where possible, to do server-side tracking. In those scenarios, it's much easier to do retrying. I haven't mentioned Moodle. We didn't use Moodle for any of these projects, but that's one that I know reasonably well. And if you use the Moodle plugin for tracking xAPI, it's got two modes. One of those modes will store all the events in the Moodle database, and then as a Moodle cron task, will then send those events over time. Now, thinking about it, actually, I don't think it checks whether or not it's successful before deleting the events. So that's an area of improvement for the Moodle plugin. We could pick up on checking whether or not the data was received successfully, and then only remove it from the database, this kind of queue of events, once that happens. But yeah, I don't think it does it at the moment. So yeah, great question. Yeah, that's something that should be a consideration. It's an extra piece of work, but it's important, if it's important, that you get all the data.
Yeah, more questions, good. There was almost a whole keynote on xAPI, so smartly done.
Thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to do these presentations. So I've been an active member of the xAPI community to some extent, and I just want to mention to others here that my background's instructional design, not development. So for those of you who are interested in participating, please realize you don't have to be a developer in order to do that. But something of interest that Kirsty noted about the context is that it makes sense from a development perspective to require the active verb and object, but it makes sense from the learning sciences side to require context, even if the development perspective on that is that should be an optional attribute. So I guess what I'm curious about is, as part of the larger spec development community itself, how can learning science and instructional designers and other related fields participate in a way that helps encourage the design of the spec to be to reflect on the needs of collecting data in a learning environment, so that the data, the spec itself doesn't sort of intrinsically say, don't worry about context, right? It should be in there, even if from a data perspective it makes sense to not require it.
Okay, I'm going to take that as two questions. The first question I'm going to take is, why are some properties in the spec optional when actually they're really important? And the second question is, how can I, as an instructional designer, get involved? So that first question, why are some properties in the spec optional? So most of the properties in the context are very important in certain scenarios. So for example, if you're being taught by somebody, or particularly if you're being coached by somebody, the instructor property is something that you really want, right? But if you're completing an e-learning course and there isn't really an instructor, that property isn't useful. So it has to be optional from an interoperability specification perspective. It can't be required. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important. And what I always, or what I sometimes say to people, I should say, when designing statements is that the optional properties are required if you've got the data. If the data is relevant, that you should fill in these properties. And I think that comes down to the recipes and things like that. So the recipe can be stricter than the specification and say, well, if you're doing this recipe, this property is required because in this context, it's always relevant. You always want to know who the instructor is. So I don't think a spec change is needed. I think it's about the recipes that sit on top of the spec that narrow down those particular things. In terms of how can you get involved, I think there's several different ways you can get involved. My background was instructional design. I was working in the HE part of an FE college in Newcastle when I first got involved in xAPI. I first got involved by asking questions, by trying to implement xAPI in Adobe Captivate version 5, which shows how old that is. And you know, I succeeded to some extent. And you know, just asking questions, then making suggestions, and then now I'm one of the main guys writing the specification. So you know, you can get involved in the spec itself, and maybe you might follow a similar route to that, or you might just want to come along and start making suggestions straight away. But then there's also a lot of groups that are doing things around the specification. So the work that Kirsty's doing, Kirsty isn't contributing to the actual specification itself, but she's contributing a lot to xAPI by the work in terms of recipes. And there's lots of other people that are working in other recipes. So you can get involved by thinking about the areas that are interested to you and mapping out a recipe or finding a recipe that already exists. You could blog about the possibilities of xAPI, or you could try it out and share with other people your experiences. So I think that they're the different ways you can get involved.
So there's one from Ellen and Daniela. Ellen, you already had your chance.
I was curious to ask, what is your experience with analysis of the data that are saved on the LRS? Because most of the time you want to do some statistical analysis or some machine learning, and then on top of that create some visualization. So do you have maybe best practices on this? Because that's a particularly interesting point for researchers.
Okay, yeah, so I will answer that question, but I'll also say that's an area that's not my area of expertise. And coming to this conference, one thing I've seen is that, you guys, obviously, statistical analysis is really, really important. Whereas in the corporate world, if you can make a pretty graph that tends to indicate something, sometimes that's enough. I probably shouldn't have said that on video, but that's, oh yeah, honesty. So, yeah, but what I will say is that in order to do that statistical analysis, you need to get all the data in one place in the first place. And you also need to get some ideas. So what Watershed does, this is going to come across a bit salesy, but what Watershed does, it allows you to pull the data all into one place. It allows you to do some level of visualizations, but it's not going to necessarily be the level that you guys will want. Maybe it might be the level that the individual teachers that are teaching, I don't know, philosophy or something like that. It might be good enough for them. But it's perhaps not going to be the same level. So what you can then do, and I think, Kirsty, you mentioned this, you can download the data, you get the data out, and then you can plug it into whatever you want to plug it into and do your more complex statistical analysis. In terms of how you do that, in fact, probably Kirsty would be a good person to ask about that.
Well, we actually, we're kind of cheap, so we're not even bothering to use an LRS at the moment. But we can set the endpoints if we want and send that. So at the moment, we are actually just in the data warehouse that's So the model for the toolkit is that you're sending to an LRS such that someone can then pull it out and do their own include.
Okay, one question here.
Yeah. hopefully a very simple one. Have you ever had to deal with the integration of two xAPI data sets that have developed independently but use the same verbs and actors and contexts? And if so, how did that go?
Yeah, so a lot of the data sets that I end up working with are ones that I have a certain amount of influence over. So the example that is in my head I'm thinking of is there's a prototype on thinkanapi.com called the golf course, which is an ironic name because it's a course about golf, but it's not a golf course. It's this example learning course. And so that's been developed by the guys at Rusty Software. And then e-learning courses like those developed in Articulate Storyline, and actually integrating data from those works quite well. But probably the reason for that is that the guys developing Storyline looked at the golf course and then also had some feedback from me about their statements to bring them closer to the golf course. So that's maybe not a fair analysis. So probably what you're thinking about, probably don't have experience of, because I try and cut it off before it gets to that point. So most of my job is finding people that are either doing stuff with xAPI or want to do stuff with xAPI, looking at the statements that they're generating and giving them feedback on those statements and saying, well, someone else is doing it in this way, maybe you should follow that. Or if you make this particular property a number instead of a string containing a number, that's going to be much easier to use. Those kind of bits of feedback. So avoiding the point where you have separate data sets.
But in those cases, where you... Sorry. But in those cases where people, that's still two independent communities that you say, oh, well, hang on, you should do it like those guys do. But at the end of such a kind of consultation or intervention, whatever you like to call it, does it actually happen that data sets from those two communities get compared or mixed, or what I'm getting at is what value do you get out of reusing verbs across different communities?
Okay, yeah, I can't think of a case study where it's happened, but we have a client at the moment who's currently using one survey tool. They're using SurveyMonkey, and they're strongly looking at SurveyGizmo, but they have historical data in SurveyMonkey. So they're going to have to get data out of SurveyMonkey. Now, SurveyGizmo, they're in beta at the moment, but they've got an xAPI implementation that exists. So when we're probably going to have to develop a custom implementation for SurveyMonkey. So what we'll have to do is reference what SurveyGizmo do and try and mirror that as closely as possible when we transform the SurveyMonkey data.
Institution and go to another institution using common context across those environments. Is that a 5-year or never kind of scenario?
I think it's definitely not shorter than 5 years. I think it's a brilliant idea.
Definitely shorter than 5 years. Major push.
Yeah, I mean, it
must happen.
It's a brilliant idea, and I know the guys at JISC are working on exactly that, really. So it requires a lot of things, and maybe Michael will want to say something in a moment. It requires, obviously, this common data format, and the work that JISC are doing is really important for that. It requires students actually having access to their data and somewhere to store it. I mean, you could give them a JSON file to keep until they go somewhere else, but would they still have it when they arrive somewhere else? So there's a lot of kind of infrastructure that needs to exist. So there are a lot of challenges to work through, I think. This was kind of one of the big selling points of xAPI, but there's a lot that needs to happen for that to...